All right, hello everyone. Thanks for being here today. Today we're here with several disabled creatives and allies in the industry to discuss disability inclusion and entertainment. So let's jump in. I'd love for everyone just to go around and tell us why disability inclusion is so important to you and your work.
To me, I get just excited by the specificity of people's experiences. Sean and I were talking about this earlier, but it's the beauty of like this wealth of talent also that's there, and sort of bringing forth people that have that specific viewpoint. So I don't know, that gets me excited, just as both a writer and a director and a creator.
I agree. I mean, we were chatting earlier, but I think like being involved with this community, like looking at the untapped talent and the untold stories that exist here, that like it really feels like this wealth of fresh experience and ideas. And I have discovered like through my own storytelling that like incredible specificity leads to universality, and that we all are human, we all have bodies, we all relate to those bodies and each other in different ways, and it's been like very eye-opening to like step into this community and realize like the untapped potential that exists here.
I worked on a show called As We See It with Sue Ann. It's where we met. A show about 20-something autistic people living independent for the first time. I met so many people that were all so different from one another, and these things that you don't just make up, it's stuff that you lived through and you experienced, and the show is awesome. And the stories were incredible, and they weren't broad. There was just stuff that like, I learned so much about you that I saw you brought into it, and it's like, oh, this is, what's a disability or not? This is just a specific story that wouldn't have been told without the opportunity to tell it.
Yeah, I mean, that was like, sorry, because I had to hide how different I was my entire life. And so that was the first time that as an adult female who's highly masking autistic, I was put in an environment where I was safe to just be myself, right?
Yeah.
And I had no idea that there was like this wealth of love, family, community, like connection, and to have like friends on the spectrum. Like, so it's like, oh, I get it. I'm not weird or out of place or don't belong in this world. Like, I fit right here.
I also think people have, I've heard this from, it's scary or expensive to hire that way. But then when you watch our show, there was, no, it's not. Nobody required anything that was substantially more than would have needed to be.
But you do get that.
But I think it's
okay.
But
you do get that. And that is the thing. And I've noticed it more and more. And I've sometimes been affected by it negatively in some ways too. I'm like, oh, when at times you're working and sort of it comes up like, oh, this person is in a wheelchair or whatever, and it's like there's variations on what that also means to bring someone with a disability on. And I've gotten, I think one of the blessings of this show doing well is I've felt my own backbone a little bit more, and like a little bit of power where I can say, totally worth it. Totally worth it.
But I've also seen for a lot of stuff that I've been a part of that accessibility doesn't always add more money, it requires more planning.
Yes.
So if you can go into it ahead of time knowing, hey, we need this to be accessible, we have a wheelchair user, spaces should be accessible. If you plan for that ahead of time, it's probably going to be cheaper than if you, wait until the day of, or you don't know where the cameras are going to be. So I think the planning and being real with it, if you line item a budget, oftentimes, I mean, it's the second meal or a certain kind of snack or, other elements end up being so much more.
But like Sean said, and like it's like it adds so much flavor, right? To like the set that's like, wow, look at how fun and diverse and beautiful this world is. I love that. Yeah.
Deeper in every way.
That part I forget about being a director is fun. Like choosing those bits.
Yeah.
As an actor, you don't have that, right?
Right.
Because I was like,
It does not help that there is one wheelchair accessible trailer
I knew it.
in the country.
Yes.
And it gets moved
That's a good
around
mission to get on.
production. And every wheelchair using actor I know has been in this trailer because it's one.
Yes.
And it gets moved around. And you're kind of like, okay, so if we're not making room for people on our sets, if there's this one trailer that you have to get somehow, like, we're not opening the door for these stories to be told. Because we're literally setting up these blockades, like you said, Nick, it's like planning. What if we had 5 of those trailers in the country?
But I also think there's a misconception that certain things are going to cost $1 million.
Right.
You know, and people are
Everything
nervous.
does.
For me, like I'm a little person, like it's certain things like, what do we need? I'm like, a stool? Like it's going to be like, you don't need to like redesign the bathroom, you know, in certain ways. So I think being upfront and being intentional with the planning process and allowing people to kind of talk about what they need.
So as a disabled writer-director myself, I'm very aware that trying to get projects with disability elements greenlit or funded can be quite difficult. Whether executives are concerned about getting it wrong when it comes to disability or just lack of familiarity with the subject matter or community, especially in the current climate of our industry. But studies have shown that people with disabilities are an untapped market and make up a huge percentage of the viewing and purchasing audience. So this question is for John and Sean. You guys are always working directly with these studios, advocating for the community. Do the industry gatekeepers understand and appreciate the audience in the market?
I think they would say they do. And I think the key here is that the more experience, the more, as what you were just saying, Nick, it's like the more experience you have. In my experience, like, again, sort of with Sean's incredible Academy Award winning film and the experience that I had on Only Murders for season 1 of a television show, we made central a character who was deaf, and there was literally one line of dialogue in the entire episode. And it was the final line, but it was through his POV. And it was the most heralded episode of that first season of the show. It really marked something significant for the show. Now, that was nothing we could have planned for, but just as we're saying, like the studios just have ideas like, oh, absolutely, I want that. But I also found myself learning at every turn the better options or the better choices. I think the more experience that people have with storytelling in general for studios, I don't see how you don't recognize. We're sitting here, I feel very privileged to sit with you because I think these are groundbreaking moments in the last 5 years within the stories that are being told that mark a huge accomplishment. However, it's not diversity in the way that is pragmatically planned out in the studio's minds. It's diversity that feels like life, and it feels like enlightened sort of like recognition of different experience. But I think if you're really being honest, you have to cut through the nervousness, basically, of studios, of the newness sometimes in other people's minds who are writing the checks. But also, when you do, it's all about finding the people who are always, your film especially, but always those people who are willing to say, oh my God, we're better off by doing that, because I haven't seen that before.
But that's what it is, it's audiences. And that's what I think like right now is a really like fearful time in our industry. Like everybody can kind of feel this like contraction happening. And a lot of executives I think are coming from a place of fear of like, am I gonna lose my job? Am I, you know, and it's not an environment that is like conducive to risk taking, I would say right now. But I would say that in terms of audience, like I think there's a miscalculation of like how much audiences are craving these stories. Yeah. And I think it's it's like a quarter of people identify as having some sort of disability, and like the percentage of stories that represent disability is like 2% or something. Like that number is just way off. And in terms of, you know, minority community, like this is a community that any of us could join at any time, right? Like
Right.
it is a group that if we live long enough, probably all of us are going to end up, being a part of the disability community. And so this othering of like those stories that are like over there somehow and don't relate to me. And I think that's a huge miscalculation, because I think audiences are really hungry for something new. I think people can smell authenticity right now. I think they can smell when it's the same stuff that's been fed to them over and over, and they're savvier and they want something that engages another part of their brain. And there's also this idea that it's like educational or like good to tell these stories. Like we should be telling these stories because like people should know, what goes on with this community. I'm like, that's not the reason to tell these stories. Like tell these stories because they're fun and they're entertaining and they're sexy and they're, and I think that drives me crazy.
Yeah, and I just want to bring up a little bit of a case study because I worked on, I directed episodes of Best Foot Forward, and we had this role on set called a production accessibility coordinator. It was a below-the-line crew member who would go around and ask people if they had any access needs, and you could privately share them with this person. And so they're the liaison between the network and the studio. So it's like if you have that person on set, that's a way for everyone to get what they need. And then if the UPM knows early on, it's not a big deal. So that's something, I've been a huge advocate for, is this position. I never heard of it until I went on this set. And there's people who have whole companies that are building these. So, hopefully they're as common as like an intimacy coordinator.
I think, Ashley, what you were telling me earlier about sort of like, there is this like military vibe to set. I think that we all feel, where it's just like you power through and you work long days and like you kill yourself and everyone has to kill themselves. And I think like, I remember, I talked to the accessibility coordinator and she was saying the interesting part was that like, yes, we were there for disabled crew members and disabled actors, but what ended up happening is people on the crew had a safe space to come up and be like, you know what? I have this knee issue and I have been hiding it. I'm in pain. You've got like grips who, like are struggling physically but cannot say anything because there's no safe place to do that on a set.
But it's also something to sort of step up and go, care for the person you're with. Consider the person you're with. Those moments on screen and creating stories and creating characters is one side of it, but the actual workplace sort of endeavor that you're all a part of making work correctly, it has to be a very open-eyed, open-eared experience to learn. And we were saying this before, Sean and I were talking earlier, and that feeling of not wanting to look like you know everything about everything is a sort of epidemic in the business. And a lot of times people are more afraid of not looking like they know, so they shut something down, or they close access, or they don't recognize, or they're scared of it.
Disability is like something that a lot of non-disabled people are very afraid to engage with because there's this fear of like misstepping or saying the wrong thing or using the wrong language, and watching people. I mean, I remember on the CODA press tour, like watching people just tie themselves in knots trying to use the right language where they're like, differently hearing, and you're like, oh my God, you're just like, just ask, like just come out and ask. But I think coming into this community, like I had so much discomfort with various things, and it was about also recognizing like your own weird internalized ableism that's been there forever that you don't even see, but the fear of misstepping or getting it wrong, I think, prevents engagement. And you're right, we do figure out how to do stunts. We figure out how to blow up buildings or flip cars or whatever. It's like figuring out how to give Nick a stool, you know what I mean? So that you can like, but I remember the first time you and I did a red carpet together, and I was like, do I come down or do like should I come down to you? And you were like, no, Sean, stand.
But you asked.
Yeah.
But the fact that I could ask, and it's like, I think that's the thing that people are like, oh, I can't engage with this. And so therefore I kind of shut down or don't bring that person into my set, or, it's like.
I think that the fear piece of it and the stigma is definitely still there. But I think the more that disabled creatives are involved, through the Easterseals Disability Film Challenge, when we'll have events with 400, 500 people with disabilities, including every disability, it becomes access and exposure just hanging out also, where you're like, oh, I guess, everything's cool. I'll talk to you instead of to the interpreter. I think it's about, having that relationship be there. And the more you're exposed, the more that you lose that awkwardness or the stigma, because you're like, oh, it's not anything I need to be worried about.
People are naturally afraid of things that are foreign to them. And I think that indirectly becomes, I don't think it's a conscious choice, but I think people are fearful of curiosity. I think it's a similar psychology to people being afraid of not knowing the answer because they think that might make them look a certain way. And you talked about masking. I think even neurotypical people mask in a way that they're not aware that they're doing because, I need to know what I'm doing. I don't want to be curious. And there's nothing sexier than curiosity. And I think that
I agree. That's a good.
agree.
What a great line, too.
Well, I can't speak for all you know what? I'll speak for all disabled people. If somebody asks you a question, nobody's mad that you're curious. You're happy that you're interested.
Yeah.
And
I have to say though, because this has been a big thing within the community of just ask, just ask. When I am broken up with and I go to buy milk at the grocery store and I'm in line and someone's like, why is your body that way? I don't want to hear it, So it's like this idea that non-disabled people just get to have the right to ask us like questions about our bodies. Like, imagine if I did that to anyone else, It's like, I find the just ask element, especially when I was dealing with a lot of internalized ableism. Like, I grew up not liking my body, not seeing different bodies represented anywhere. And so I would put it in the back of my brain. And then if I'd be just out having a great time, but someone looks at me weird or, starts to ask questions, I would have a meltdown. So it's like the asking questions thing for me is pretty complicated because,
that's interesting. Is that always?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I feel now that I'm on a different part of my journey in my life where I've really embraced my disability, the disability community. I make content about disability that now I don't mind answering those questions. But I think when I was in a place of real vulnerability, like we don't know where people are at on their disability journey, and just to ask those questions can feel really invasive. So
I think the questions that it's like process questions, right?
Yeah.
It's like I'm coming into a situation with, every deaf person's different. Some people sign, some people don't. It's like, how do you like to communicate? How do I communicate with you in this moment? Or it's a different process question when you were talking about like standing on set for a long time or like having physical pain. Like, is there something that what is the best way for us to engage in this process together? I think that's the fear I'm talking about. Not not fear to go like, hey, what's up with why is your body different? But more just like, how should this go, right? If we're gonna make something together, if we're gonna collaborate on set,
which I think those access needs, like anything dietary restrictions, anything, and even when I directed on this show, I just said, all I need is a short, director's chair. That's it. I don't want the tall ones because I'll probably tip over trying to get into it. But, so I think it's just those more generalized questions to especially if you're working on something, that just have people fill that out, have a PA create the sheet and go around and hand it out. And I think that will change a lot of things of how, it doesn't make it awkward. And sometimes I don't need much, but it is nice to be able to, ask for or have those things available when you need them.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
Let's say we're working together, best foot forward perhaps, and I am curious about something that feels, at least to me, having this as pragmatic. I want to know this answer, but now if I'm being told specifically you and me, maybe you might not be in the place to ask. If this were a few years ago, what are my options? Are my options to not ask, or could I say, hey, I have a question that involves, how would I frame it to where is now a good time to ask it? How could I find out that information that's valuable, to me at least?
Yeah, I think it's a really complex question because I just think having to know something about a person and their medical diagnosis is a very personal thing, and I think it depends why you're asking. Is it just you're curious what this thing is and you want to know? then I think sometimes that can be harmless, but it's really asking yourself, like, why do I need to know this information? And going, does it matter if I know this information? Am I still going to treat them like a human being just within society? You know, so I think it's asking why you want to know, you know, and that's how I feel about it. I don't know how, because, you know, you have a physical disability that is, you know, more common. Mine's super rare. So people don't see people like me as much, you know, so I don't know how you feel about it.
I mean, for me, like, everything about my life has been informed by me being little, and it's part of this community I'm in, and through the Easterseals Disability Film Challenge, 750 films. So filmmakers over the last 11 years. I know so many different people with disabilities. So for me, just as a person, I think I'm extroverted, and, you know, it was something that my journey of being little was always like, this is the way I am. What you can ask me. And so I think everybody is on a different journey. And I think beyond disability, I think recently there's just been, like, society has just kind of gone a little bit too much of, like, asking questions at the wrong time or being inappropriate. And I think overall, in terms of the disability angle, it goes back to that there has been historically a lack of access for people with disabilities that are around people that not only in the entertainment industry at, like, a, you know, a C-suite level, in executives. So I think it's just exposure.
That's it, though. It's whether, as you're saying, it's sort of whether the disability is sort of like on the surface in front of you or within. All of the things we're hiding, all of the things we're masking, or other things, anything you've grown up with. But I think the question, and you feel it, I'm sure, you feel it. I love this discussion. I love the feeling, as you were saying, the humanist approach is really important to me because I think that is the most honest place we can be at. And I feel most comfortable when people are sharing their honest truth and their vulnerability, because that's the place, I think, the foundation of which we all live is in our most vulnerable place, and everything else is masking and everything else is putting on to be in the world and not be embarrassed or not be, you know, too probative and not be too, you know, careful is the other thing. You sort of don't want to be either. But I just find it like the most warm blanket bath feeling that I have with people is when we've cut through all of those layers above us and we're able to recognize each other as compelling, interesting, complex, experienced human beings in the world getting through with our own individual experiences. And we don't know what is going on with anybody at any given moment, emotionally, physically, spiritually, anything that's been happening. So anytime anyone talks, shares, asks, but I understand that gray area because you're just like, okay, not now. And
but what you guys are talking about is like each of you have been so successful in developing or acting as these complex disabled characters, and so often the story doesn't even have to be about disability or not. So how do we get the industry to champion more stories like the ones you guys have told? Like, does it have to center around disability?
But I think there's an idea of, again, like character, like specificity of character and richness of story. And I would say, like, telling a story because it's a disability story. It's like, it's a love story, or it's a, you know, because drilling down, we're all people. We all go through the same things in life, the same heartbreak, the same disappointment, the same joys, and, you know, and I think the key to telling these stories is, like, I, as a writer and filmmaker, I'm always looking for myself in whatever I'm telling, and I think that has been the most interesting part of engaging with the community and in these stories is, like, there's always something else happening with the disability. Is it about being an outsider? Is it about being alienated or coming in, or, you know, and then the richness of the story and the color is painted by the individual experiences. there's a feeling with representation, right, when it's a community that has been severely underrepresented, that every story that comes out has to make up somehow for that incredible lack of representation, right? It's like, how do we fix all the, problems of the past and like really, but I think the only way representation really truly happens is kind of in like the accumulation of stories.
But I think ultimately too, it's very important for roles to be written for people with disabilities, for the TV system, and to have a writer say, this person is in a wheelchair, this person is on the autism spectrum, because that breakdown goes out and that becomes an opportunity for all these other people to get auditions. It just happened.
That pipeline is super important, right?
Yeah.
If you audition once every 2 years, you're probably gonna suck in that audition because you're not going out all the time. So for these actors to like work those muscles, for crew members to like get experience, writers to get in rooms.
But it's creating also other roles and other opportunities. I'm not gonna be able to carry stuff. In fact, I'm gonna ask each of you to help carry things for me later on. Outside of the shoot, I have things that but like you're ultimately gonna like be able to have a different skill set though.
Yeah.
I went to business school. I know how to do other things. And I think creating other roles and other access into other pipelines aside from acting is also another layer. Because again, it goes back to when you see people in leadership roles that have disabilities, beyond being in front of the camera, that changes things. Because automatically the writers are like, yeah, it'd be cool to have a role about, somebody with cerebral palsy or somebody blind or somebody deaf or a little person or wheelchair user with a rare, bone or autistic it becomes the afterthought.
So if you guys were to write a note of encouragement regarding disability inclusion to Hollywood producers or executives, what would you want to say? Like, what is your call to action? We'll start with Sean and go around this way.
A note of encouragement. I mean, I think my own story with Coda is a note of encouragement, right? Like that was a studio movie that was not made by the studio. And if I think about all the things I was told that were the issues with the movie, that ended up being the very things that it was celebrated for, audiences connected and audiences saw something new in that story that they wanted to know more about. And I have to say that like you can't underestimate, what these stories will do when they're told, and not just told, but told with care, and told with like an eye to authenticity, to inclusion, to having people be a part of the storytelling that have lived that experience. But I don't know, I guess that's my note. That's a long note of encouragement, but it's like, look what can happen when you just choose to hone in on an untold story and tell it well.
I mean, that's like what Sean said. I was like, I'm shocked. Like literally, like our short film is winning all these festivals, and I'm like, what? Because I had no, it's like, it's wild. It's like the audiences are like, oh my God, I've never seen that in my life, and I want to watch it, which is the entire premise.
But what's the note to the studio?
The note to the studio is, I just hope we can make a lot of money. Your film, I hope, made a lot of money. Your show's doing very well. Let's just, I hope, make a lot of money, and then we can make more films and hire more people. I'm unemployed. Get your job, somebody.
That's not a note, that's a poster. I like that.
Yeah.
That's good.
I'm 85% of unemployed autistic people. It's been 2 years since As We See It. I was like, okay.
Note to the studio would be, you have to work past the fear if you're doing anything, I think, of value creatively, always. And so it's just about being conscious about the fearful reaction and pushing through it. Things like that, like putting someone at the center of a television show would be thrilling to me to see anyone with any sort of neurodivergent sort of thing or anything with a person with any disabilities. I think it's so high time. And I'm sure we have done this many times, but I think it's been a little while always.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm feeling optimistic. There's just so much talent out there with disabilities. And if you think about the numbers, 1 in 4 Americans identify as having a disability. That's millions of people, that's billions of dollars of spending money. So again, I'm encouraged and I feel very optimistic and proud that I've seen a lot of opportunities come for Easterseals Disability Film Challenge participants. And I just, encourage studio execs, writers, financiers to get on board, because there's a strong case to make money and to, have a great project.
Thank you, Nick.
So good.
Studios, I think, have 2 priorities: to make art and to make money. Not necessarily in that order, maybe. There's only so many things. Try out literally a diverse amount of things to see what works. Find the people that are able to do that honestly. When is something that is honest and good not work, unless because nobody saw it? So I think keep making stuff with all the people, including the diversity, not from a moral look at me, this is educational and important standpoint, but just from literally a diversity, like, let's have a lot of different stories.
So the last question here is actually like, how can organizations like Easterseals be supportive of your work and foster greater inclusion and access?
I think what I've watched Nick do with the Disability Film Challenge, I mean, that's been amazing. Like, that started as such a small thing, and like watching you like blow that up, also like inadvertently become the manager of every disabled actor in Hollywood, which you have, but like the finding, and I think Easterseals supports that obviously, and like, what are the avenues to showcase talent, get it out there? Because you're right, like if you make it and nobody sees it, then like it's sort of, it doesn't exist really in the world. So like, what are the avenues? And I think for some of these organizations like Easterseals, I think like the real thing is like people are making projects all the time. We were talking about like now getting it out in the world. Like, how do you get people to see it? How do you break through? And I think that is a place that these organizations can really step in and help, is to amplify and go like, there are the artists who are making the things. It's just like, then now like, what are the avenues?
I think the other thing too, just in line with that, to me, it's like also, it's the avenue that Easterseals or potentially any other organization has found that, as you guys are all doing, I feel, to sort of find a way in that might not be the most obvious.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a proud board member of Easterseals Southern California, and speaking on behalf of the organization, I mean, this is an awesome thing. I'm honored to be a part of this, but ultimately the journey, as we talked about when I created the Disability Film Challenge, it was small. We had 5 films that first year, kept growing year after year, but partnering with Easterseals in 2017, it grew big time, But at the end of the day, we are in a time where no matter what you are as a comedian or as an actor, or as a filmmaker, you do have to market yourself. I mean, social media is a blessing, and it's something that is a tool that we can all use, but it is also something that we need to use. So how can we get the word out there? And, I think that that's an amazing opportunity.
And that it doesn't stay niche, because I think like the problem, we've discussed this, like, if you're stuck in a diversity program all the time and you're moving on to the next one and you're on a panel, like I love that this panel is happening. I also wish that there were more voices included in this conversation. And how do we start to have this conversation in a big way where everyone sitting around here is not already on board with what we're talking about? Like, how do we start to have that conversation where we're sort of including people who are maybe scared as a like female filmmaker, and like every panel I was on was about like being a woman director, and it was just like after a while it starts to be like, okay, we're all just like having this conversation with ourselves, and how do we break this conversation out? Let's march into everyone's office in town and start having this conversation. Let's put billboards up on Sunset to like wake up this dialogue, because it needs to be happening with everybody, not just people that are like already on board with being allies.
All right, thanks everyone for being here. I think it was a really amazing conversation, and hopefully more to come from everyone.